The desperate cries of a small child echoed across the riverbank, her voice trembling with fear as she begged for mercy from the very person who should have protected her. The words, "Please don't push me," hung in the air like a dark cloud, witnessed by a man whose wealth was about to become secondary to an act of unexpected heroism. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The evening air was thick with fog as 7-year-old Clara Smith teetered on the crumbling edge of the old stone bridge in Eldonford. The ancient stones beneath her feet were slick with moss, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and rain. Her small hands trembled against the rough texture of the parapet, knuckles white with tension. In the distance, the village lights flickered like hesitant stars, too far away to offer comfort. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the hungry gurgle of the river below. "I want to go home." Behind her, the elegant but icy figure of her stepmother, Margaret Smith, loomed with chilling determination. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the child's shoulder, nails digging through the thin fabric of Clara's coat. Margaret's face, usually composed for the villagers' admiring glances, had transformed into something hard and unfamiliar in the gathering darkness. "You embarrassed me today," the woman hissed, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "In front of everyone at the schoolhouse. Do you have any idea what that does to our reputation?" Clara's eyes welled with tears. She hadn't meant to knock over the display at the school fundraiser. It was an accident. Just like all the other accidents, Margaret never seemed to forgive. The little girl's gaze darted toward the churning water below, dark and menacing in the twilight. "I'm sorry," she pleaded, her voice quivering. "It won't happen again." Margaret's grip tightened, her wedding ring pressing painfully into Clara's shoulder. "Maybe now you'll learn to listen," she hissed. Her push slight but filled with intent. "Maybe you'll remember what happens to little girls who don't behave." Clara felt her balance shift, her small body tilting forward over the edge. Terror flooded her veins as her feet scrambled for purchase on the slippery stone. The river seemed to rise up to meet her, its cold breath reaching for her face. "Please don't push me into the river, stepmother." Clara's scream pierced the twilight, echoing across the water and bouncing between the trees that lined the riverbank. Margaret's hand pressed forward again, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. But just as Clara felt herself slipping further, a powerful splash erupted from the water below. The sound cut through the fog like a knife, startling both of them. Margaret froze, her grip loosening just enough for Clara to regain her footing. They both peered over the edge, the stepmother's perfect composure finally cracking as something or someone moved in the dark waters beneath the old stone bridge. The villagers gasped, their eyes wide with shock as a figure burst from the shadowy water below the bridge, soaked to the bone, furious and unstoppable. Water cascaded from his expensive clothes as he clambered up the riverbank with surprising agility for a man his age. It was Robert Johnson, the eccentric millionaire inventor who had recently returned to Eldonford after years abroad. Many had thought him lost forever, and to little Clara Smith, he was a complete stranger. Though unbeknownst to her, this dripping wet man was actually her true uncle. "Step away from her," Robert commanded, his voice cutting through the evening mist like steel. His normally well-groomed appearance was now disheveled, dark hair plastered against his forehead. But the authority in his stance was unmistakable. The small crowd that had gathered on the bridge fell silent, their collective breath held in anticipation. Several villagers recognized the inventor immediately. His return to the village had been the subject of gossip for weeks, though few had actually seen him since his arrival. Robert's glare burned through the fog as he reached the bridge and hoisted Clara from the brink with strong, protective hands. His arms trembled, not from the cold water that soaked his expensive suit, but from a mixture of shock and unbridled rage. The child looked up at her rescuer with wide, confused eyes, uncertain whether to fear this stranger or thank him. "Uncle Robert," Margaret Smith's voice faltered, her composed facade cracking for just an instant before she regained her icy demeanor. "What a surprising appearance." The crowd's murmurs swelled as they processed this unexpected family connection. The elegant stepmother recoiled slightly, her carefully orchestrated plan foiled by the most unexpected witness. Her manicured fingers fidgeted with her necklace, a nervous habit she rarely displayed in public. "You know exactly who I am," he replied, his voice low but carrying across the old stone structure. "And I know what I just saw." Clara remained silent, shivering against the tall man's side, her small hand clutching the damp fabric of his jacket. The villagers of Eldenford exchanged glances, their loyalties visibly shifting as they processed the scene before them. That leap into the river would become the first ripple in a year-long storm, changing Clara's life and the village forever. As Robert guided the child away from the bridge, Margaret's eyes narrowed, calculating her next move. The battle for Clara had only just begun, and Eldenford would never be the same quiet village again. In the 3 days following the incident at the bridge, Clara Smith's world transformed completely. The Eldenford villagers whispered behind cupped hands as Robert Johnson, still bearing the river's dampness in his expensive clothes, marched into the local police station demanding an investigation. His voice carried the authority of his wealth and the passion of his conviction. "She tried to harm my niece," he insisted, producing a water-damaged envelope from his pocket. The battered letter, written in his late sister's delicate handwriting, named him as Clara's guardian should anything happen to her. The document had been hidden among his sister's possessions for years, only discovered after her mysterious passing. Margaret's composure barely masked her seething rage. She moved through the village with practiced elegance, stopping to chat with shopkeepers and neighbors. "Poor Clara has such an active imagination," she would say with a sympathetic sigh. "The child has been troubled since her mother died, seeing things, making up stories." Her words fell like poison into receptive ears. Perhaps the pressure of raising such a difficult child became too much for her, some villagers murmured, while others recalled how Margaret had always presented herself as the picture of maternal devotion. Meanwhile, Clara sat silently in the police station, her small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. When asked questions, she answered in a voice barely above a whisper, her eyes constantly darting toward the door, as if expecting her stepmother to appear. By the week's end, Robert had secured temporary guardianship. He arrived at Margaret's cottage in his sleek automobile, ignoring the curious onlookers gathered across the street. Clara emerged with a single suitcase, her treasured sketchbook clutched to her chest. "This isn't over," Margaret hissed as the child passed. "No one will believe you." The Johnson estate stood on the outskirts of Eldenford, its stone walls and sprawling gardens both impressive and intimidating. Clara gazed up at the mansion with wide eyes as Robert guided her through the iron gates. "Your mother grew up here," he told her gently. "This was her home, too." That night, as Clara settled into a bedroom larger than Margaret's entire cottage, Robert sat in his study, surrounded by old photographs and letters. His sister's death had been ruled an accident, but the timing, just months before her marriage to Margaret's cousin, had always troubled him. Now, with Clara's safety secured, he could finally begin unraveling the truth. In the village below, Margaret poured tea for Mrs. Thompson, the elderly librarian's visit providing the perfect audience for her performance of the wronged stepmother. Little did she know that the quiet woman observing her tears had known Clara's mother better than anyone, and harbored doubts of her own. Clara Smith sat cross-legged on the window seat, her small fingers clutching a pencil as she traced the winding path of the river below. The Johnson estate stood high on a hill overlooking Eldenford, giving her a perfect view of the spot where her life had nearly ended. Each sketch captured not only the river's gentle curves but also the darkness she felt lurking beneath its surface. "I can still hear her voice," she whispered to herself, shading in the shadows under the old stone bridge. Margaret's threats echoed in her mind whenever the house grew too quiet. At night, Clara would wake gasping, certain she was falling through empty air toward cold water. Robert found her there one morning, surrounded by drawings. He studied them silently, his inventor's eyes noting every detail. "You have your mother's talent," he said finally, his voice gentle. "She could make paper speak too." The 7-year-old looked up, surprised. No one had ever compared her to her mother before. That afternoon, Robert wheeled a strange contraption into the dusty drawing room, a mechanical kaleidoscope of his own design that projected colorful patterns across the walls. Clara watched, mesmerized, as light danced across the faded wallpaper. "This house has been empty too long," her uncle declared. "It needs young voices." Within days, the mansion's hollow halls began to fill with sounds Clara had never expected to hear. Laughter, questions, the clatter of tools and toys. Robert opened his workshop to curious children from the village, transforming the East Wing into a wonderland of invention and creativity. "Try this," Oliver Brown suggested one rainy afternoon, showing Clara how to build a tiny water wheel. The boy's easy smile made her feel less alone, though she noticed how carefully he avoided looking at her river drawings. Mrs. Thompson visited often, bringing books and staying for tea. The elderly librarian moved through the grand rooms with comfortable familiarity, sometimes pausing to straighten a picture frame or dust a forgotten shelf. "Your mother loved this house," she told Clara. She would be pleased to hear it filled with children again. For the first time since coming to live with her uncle, Clara felt something like belonging. She started leaving her window seat to join the others, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Yet even as hope flickered to life within her, Clara couldn't escape the shadow that followed. Word reached the estate that Margaret was visiting neighbors, her elegant figure moving from house to house like a dark promise. "She's telling stories about you both," Mrs. Thompson warned Robert one evening when she thought Clara couldn't hear. Nasty, frightening stories. That night, Clara added something new to her river sketch, a small figure standing firm against the current, refusing to be swept away. Margaret Smith prowled through Eldenford like a shadow, her elegant appearance masking the venom in her words. She cornered mothers at the village square, her voice dropping to a concerned whisper as she described Clara's troubling behaviors and unstable tendencies. The rumors spread like wildfire through the small community. "I worry about the other children's safety," Margaret would say, dabbing at false tears with an embroidered handkerchief. "Robert encourages such dangerous activities in that workshop of his. And Clara? Well, you've heard about the incident at the bridge." Within weeks, the Johnson estate's once bustling gardens fell silent. Parents called their children home earlier, made excuses about prior commitments, and avoided Clara's hopeful invitations. She watched from the mansion's tall windows as former playmates walked past without looking up, their parents hurrying them along with tight grips on small shoulders. "Why don't they come anymore?" Clara asked her uncle one evening, her small fingers tracing patterns on the window pane. Robert sighed, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes people believe lies because the truth is harder to accept," he said, unable to shield her from this new pain. The isolation might have consumed her completely if not for the village library, a stone building with creaking floors and the comforting smell of aged paper. It was there Clara met Mrs. Thompson properly for the first time. The elderly librarian, with silver hair twisted into a neat bun, watched the child hiding between the shelves, seeking solace in stories when reality had become too harsh. "Books find us when we need them most," Mrs. Thompson said softly, approaching with a stack of carefully selected volumes. "These helped another little girl once, many years ago." The librarian never pushed or pried. Instead, she created a sanctuary where Clara could breathe freely. Away from suspicious glances and whispered judgments. Between reading sessions, Mrs. Thompson shared stories of remarkable children who had overcome impossible odds, her kind eyes twinkling behind wire-rimmed spectacles. One rainy afternoon, as Clara helped reorganize a shelf of local history books, a yellowed photograph slipped from between dusty pages. The image showed a younger Mrs. Thompson standing beside Clara's mother, both smiling broadly outside this very library. "You knew my mother?" Clara whispered, fingers trembling as she held the photograph. The elderly woman nodded, her expression both sad and warm. "Very well, dear. She trusted me with certain things Margaret never found." She hesitated before adding, "When you're ready, there's more your mother wanted you to know." For the first time since that terrible night on the bridge, Clara felt something beyond fear and confusion. She felt hope. The summer heat hung thick over Eldenford, turning the air sticky and heavy. Clara Smith sat by the riverbank, her sketchbook balanced on her knees as she traced the water's edge with careful strokes. The Johnson estate had become her sanctuary, but Robert's constant inventions and Mrs. Thompson's books couldn't fill the hollow loneliness that still echoed within her. "That's not how the river bends there," came a voice from behind her. Clara startled, nearly dropping her pencil into the murky water below. A boy about her age stood watching, hands shoved deep in his pockets, a mischievous smile playing at his lips. "I'm Oliver Brown," he announced, plopping down beside her without waiting for an invitation. "I live just over there." He pointed to a modest cottage visible through the trees downstream. Clara regarded him cautiously. After everything with Margaret, trusting didn't come easily. "I'm Clara," she replied softly. "I know who you are. Everyone does." His laughter burst forth suddenly, infectious and bright, making Clara smile despite herself. Yet behind his cheerful demeanor, she noticed the shadow in his eyes, a familiar sadness she recognized all too well. Over the following weeks, Oliver became a constant presence. He showed Clara hidden paths along the riverbank, taught her to skip stones across the water's surface, and shared village secrets no adult would ever tell. One afternoon, as they dangled their feet from a low-hanging branch, Oliver grew unusually quiet. "My sister Emily used to love this spot," he finally said, his voice barely audible above the river's gentle flow. "She fell in 3 years ago. The current was too strong." His fingers traced invisible patterns on the bark. "Sometimes I think the river keeps her secrets." Clara reached for his hand, understanding loss in a way few children could. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Oliver squeezed her fingers, then brightened suddenly. "Let's make a map of all the river's secrets." They spent days charting the river's course, marking spots with names like Whisper Cove and Memory Bend. Clara's artistic skill brought their creation to life, while Oliver's knowledge of the waterway made it accurate. On their hand-drawn map, they marked places where secrets sleep, quiet pools and hidden inlets where the water seemed to hold its breath. Their friendship became Clara's refuge. With Oliver by her side, she found the courage to venture closer to the bridge where everything had changed. Each step toward confronting her fears felt possible with his steady presence beside her. "We'll solve the mystery together," Oliver promised one evening as they watched the sunset paint the water gold. "Whatever happened to your mom, whatever Margaret did, we'll find out." Clara nodded, feeling braver than she had in months. In Oliver's friendship, she'd found not just companionship, but the strength to face the truths that had haunted her family for so long. Robert Johnson's quest for answers intensified as summer nights stretched longer. In his sprawling estate, the eccentric millionaire sat surrounded by stacks of journals, letters, and faded photographs, his fingers tracing connections that had remained hidden for years. The inventor's normally tidy workshop had transformed into an investigative headquarters, with timelines and notes pinned to every available surface. "There must be something here," he muttered, rubbing his tired eyes as the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight. Each document revealed another thread in Margaret Smith's elaborate deception. Bank statements showed suspicious transfers. Legal papers contained subtle alterations. Even Clara's birth certificate held inconsistencies that only a trained eye could detect. One rainy evening, while Clara slept soundly upstairs, Robert discovered a hidden compartment in an antique desk that had belonged to his sister. His hands trembled as he extracted a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time. Inside lay a collection of mementos, pressed flowers, ticket stubs, and beneath them all, a carefully wrapped painting. The portrait took his breath away. There was his sister, Elizabeth, her smile radiant and eyes full of life, the same artistic expression Clara had inherited. Beside Elizabeth stood a man whose features mirrored Robert's own, the same jawline, the same thoughtful gaze. On the back, a simple inscription, "Our secret happiness, forever." "My God," Robert whispered, his voice breaking. The truth crashed over him like a wave. This wasn't just some family friend or distant relative. This was Clara's father, a man Margaret had erased from history. The following morning, Mrs. Thompson arrived with more evidence. The elderly librarian had been quietly conducting her own research, piecing together village records and forgotten conversations. "Margaret didn't just take your niece," she explained, her silver hair catching the morning light. "She buried every trace of Elizabeth's happiness. The marriage, the letters, the photographs, all of it hidden or destroyed." Robert paced the length of his study, fury and grief battling within him. She wanted the inheritance, he realized. Clara's inheritance, my sister's estate. That evening, as he watched Clara sketching by the window, Robert made a silent vow. The inventor who had created marvels of engineering now faced his greatest challenge, reconstructing a stolen past and protecting a fragile future. He would shield his niece from Margaret's manipulations, whatever the personal cost. "Uncle Robert?" Clara looked up from her drawing. "Are you all right?" He smiled, hiding the storm behind his eyes. "Just thinking about tomorrow," he answered. "We have much to do." Margaret Smith's perfectly manicured nails tapped rhythmically against the polished mahogany of her solicitor's desk as she finalized her most calculated move yet. The petition lay before her, each word carefully chosen to paint Robert Johnson as an unfit guardian. "Emotional neglect and corrupting influences," she muttered, signing with a flourish. "The court will see things my way." Within days, the news spread through Eldenford like wildfire. The village, once united in its quaint traditions, found itself fractured. At the local pub, heated debates erupted over pints of ale. "Those contraptions of his aren't natural," insisted George from the bakery, shaking his head. "My Timmy came home talking about flying machines and underwater breathing apparatus. What kind of ideas is he putting in their heads?" Across the table, Mrs. Winters from the flower shop disagreed vehemently. "Robert's brought life back to this village. Have you seen the children's faces when they leave his estate? Full of wonder they are." The division deepened as the court date approached. Some mothers kept their children away from the Johnson estate, eyeing the mansion with suspicion. Others deliberately brought their little ones, making a point of thanking the inventor for his generosity. At the estate, Clara sat by her bedroom window, pencil moving across paper with increasing confidence. The 7-year-old's drawings had evolved from simple sketches to complex scenes that told stories. The bridge, the river, shadowy figures with familiar silhouettes. Her art teacher had called them remarkably advanced for someone so young. "Uncle Robert," she called one evening, her small voice trembling, "will I have to go back to her?" The millionaire knelt beside his niece, his inventor's hands, calloused yet gentle, taking hers. "I promised to protect you, and I will." But that night, Clara's sleep was troubled. In her dreams, the river rose, dark and hungry. Margaret stood on the bridge, her elegant figure silhouetted against storm clouds, lips curved in that familiar cold smile. Clara would wake gasping, sheets tangled around her small body. Oliver Brown visited daily, bringing river stones and interesting leaves for Clara's collection. "My dad says your uncle is the smartest man in the county," he told her, his loyalty unwavering despite the village gossip. Mrs. Thompson quietly rallied support among the more influential villagers. The elderly librarian's reputation for wisdom carried weight, and her defense of Robert made many reconsider their positions. As autumn leaves began to fall, Clara's drawings grew bolder, more detailed, more truthful. She drew the knight on the bridge with unflinching accuracy, Margaret's hand on her back, the terror in her own eyes, Robert emerging from the water below. "This is my story," she whispered to the paper, "and they need to hear it." The crisp autumn morning brought a chill that seemed to seep through the stone walls of Eldonford's library. Clara Smith sat alone by the window, her small fingers tracing patterns on the foggy glass. The library had become her sanctuary in the weeks since moving to the Johnson estate, a place where Margaret's whispers couldn't reach her. Mrs. Thompson approached with unusual urgency, her silver hair catching the morning light. The elderly librarian glanced around the empty room before pressing something into Clara's palm. Her mother's handwriting, delicate, flowing script she recognized from birthday cards kept hidden under her mattress, addressed it simply to "My dearest Clara." A faded red ribbon, frayed at the edges, sealed the precious contents. With trembling fingers, the 7-year-old broke the seal. The paper inside smelled faintly of lavender, her mother's favorite. Tears blurred her vision as she began to read. "My darling Clara," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I fear the worst has happened. Margaret isn't who she pretends to be. She came into our lives with calculated purpose, isolating us from family, especially your Uncle Robert. The threats began after your father died. I've documented everything in journals, hidden where she won't find them." Clara's breath caught. The librarian placed a steadying hand on her shoulder as she continued reading. "Trust Robert, my sweet girl. The locket he carries contains the truth. Most importantly, remember this. Your voice matters, my darling. Never let anyone silence it." The revelation crashed through Clara like the river's current. All those nights she'd spent believing she was the problem, the burden, the reason for Margaret's cruelty, they shattered in an instant. The stepmother's manipulations suddenly appeared as clear as the autumn sky outside. The subtle threats, the isolation from other children, the whispered lies about Clara's delusions. Mrs. Thompson knelt beside her, weathered hands enveloping Clara's small ones. "Your mother was very brave," she murmured, "and so are you." For the first time since that terrible night on the bridge, Clara felt something shift inside her, grief mingled with a fierce, unexpected resolve. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't troublesome. She was simply a victim of Margaret's elaborate web of deception. "What do I do now?" Clara whispered, clutching the letter to her chest. The librarian's eyes gleamed with determination. "We find those journals, and we tell your uncle everything." Autumn leaves drifted lazily across Eldonford, painting the village in worn hues of gold and amber. Robert Johnson stood on the balcony of his estate, watching as village children scurried across the lawn, their arms laden with handcrafted inventions and artwork. The mansion, once cold and empty, now hummed with creative energy as he transformed it into a sanctuary for young minds. "Uncle Robert, do you think they'll like my drawings?" Clara Smith clutched her sketchbook, her small fingers tracing the edges nervously. Since receiving her mother's letter, a new determination had sparked in her eyes. "They'll love them," he assured her, gently squeezing her shoulder. "Your mother would be proud." Inside, the grand hall had been converted into an exhibition space. Children hung paintings, displayed contraptions made from household items, and arranged handwritten stories on tables. Clara carefully selected a wall near the window, where the light caught her river sketches perfectly. Each drawing told a fragment of her story: the bridge, the water, the fear, but also the hope that followed. "I'm going to show these at the Spring Festival," she announced, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "People need to know the truth." Across the village, Margaret Smith surveyed the renovations to her cottage with cold satisfaction. Marble countertops, imported furniture, and silk curtains transformed the modest home into a showcase of luxury, all funded by Clara's inheritance, cleverly diverted through legal loopholes and falsified documents. "The Johnson estate will be mine eventually," she told the contractor, running her manicured fingers along a new granite surface. "It's only a matter of time." Her campaign against Robert grew more insidious by the day. At the village tea room, she cornered Mrs. Wilkins, the baker's wife. "Did you know about Robert's scandal in London?" Margaret whispered, her voice dripping with false concern. "They say that's why he disappeared for all those years. Something about stolen patents and ruined investors." The rumors spread like wildfire. Some villagers began to question the inventor's motives for returning to Eldenford. Others defended him, pointing to his generosity and the positive changes he'd brought to their community. Oliver Brown defended Robert fiercely among his schoolmates. "My dad says Mr. Johnson is the best thing that's happened to this village in years," he insisted, his loyalty to Clara extending to her uncle. Mrs. Thompson watched the division growing from behind her library desk, her wise eyes troubled. "Eldenford stands at a crossroads," she told Clara during their weekly reading session. "Truth and deception are battling for our village's soul." As autumn deepened, the battle lines were drawn. Clara continued preparing her exhibition with quiet determination, unaware that Margaret had already set her sights on the Spring Festival and planned to ensure that Clara's truth would never see the light of day. The first frost painted Eldenford's windows with delicate patterns as winter settled over the village. Clara Smith, huddled by the fireplace in the Johnson estate, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. Outside, snow blanketed the grounds, but it was what lay beneath the surface that now consumed her thoughts. Robert Johnson entered the room, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. In his hands, he carried a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "Look at this," he said, placing it beside Clara's drawings. The resemblance was uncanny. Her sketches of the river's bends and hidden alcoves matched diagrams in his old journals with remarkable precision. "How is this possible?" Clara whispered, tracing the matching lines with her fingertip. "I've never seen these before." Her uncle smiled sadly. "Your mother had the same gift. She could see patterns where others saw only chaos." He pointed to a particular curve in the river. "This spot, you've drawn it exactly as she did 20 years ago." The river itself seemed determined to reveal its secrets. After heavy rains, the swollen waters receded, leaving behind strange treasures along the banks: a tarnished locket, fragments of letters, and once, a small wooden box containing a child's bracelet. Clara collected these artifacts, arranging them in her room like pieces of a puzzle she was only beginning to understand. One snowy afternoon, Oliver Brown visited, bringing biscuits his mother had baked. The two children sat in the mansion's conservatory, watching snowflakes drift past the glass ceiling. Clara noticed how Oliver's gaze kept returning to her collection of river findings. "My sister had a bracelet like that," he finally said, his voice barely audible. Clara looked up, surprised. "Emily, you never talk about her." Oliver's eyes filled with tears. "She didn't drown like everyone thinks. She was Margaret's ward before you. Did you know that? After my parents died, Margaret took her in. Emily wrote me letters about how scared she was, but nobody believed me when she disappeared. Clara's heart pounded as pieces clicked into place. When did this happen? 3 years ago. She was 8. Oliver wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The police said she ran away, but Emily would never leave me. Clara reached for his hand, her own trembling. I believe you, she whispered, and I think my uncle will too. That evening, as snow fell silently outside, Clara and Oliver showed Robert the bracelet. The millionaire's face grew pale as he recognized it. A new determination hardened in his eyes, the mystery of Emily's fate now intertwined with their own. The two children, bound by shared grief and purpose, made a solemn pact beside the fireplace. Whatever secrets lay hidden in Eldenford's past, they would uncover them together. The storm came without warning, a furious assault of wind and water that battered Eldenford with relentless fury. Thunder cracked overhead as the river, usually so placid, swelled beyond its boundaries, consuming everything in its path. Margaret Smith's cottage, perched too close to the riverbank, despite Robert Johnson's previous warnings, was among the first casualties. Clara watched from the safety of the Johnson estate as raindrops raced down the window panes. "Will the water reach us here?" she whispered, her small fingers clutching her uncle's sleeve. "We're on higher ground," Robert assured her, though his eyes betrayed concern not for their safety, but for what the flood might uncover. For 3 days, Margaret's whereabouts remained unknown. Her cottage stood partially submerged, its foundations exposed like open wounds. The village buzzed with speculation. Some whispered she had been swept away. Others claimed she had fled to avoid facing the mounting evidence against her. Clara experienced a storm of her own emotions, relief mingled with guilt, fear tangled with a forbidden sense of hope. Each night, she woke gasping from dreams of murky water and reaching hands. Oliver Brown visited daily, bringing small treasures he'd found washed up on the new shoreline, smooth stones and waterlogged books that they dried carefully by the fire. "My sister loved storms," Oliver confided one afternoon as they watched the rain. "She said they cleaned away the old and made room for new beginnings." Mrs. Thompson arrived with warm scones and comforting stories, her silver hair neatly pinned despite the chaos outside. The elderly librarian sat with Clara for hours, teaching her to knit, the repetitive motions soothing the child's frayed nerves. On the 4th day, as the waters began to recede, leaving mud and debris in their wake, Margaret appeared at the Johnson estate's gate. She was unrecognizable, her elegant clothes caked with mud, her carefully styled hair hanging in wet ropes around her face. Most shocking was her expression. The mask of superiority had washed away, leaving raw vulnerability in its place. Clara, watching from behind the curtains, felt something shift inside her. The woman who had tormented her, who had nearly ended her life on that bridge, suddenly seemed small and broken. Not a monster, but a human being capable of fear. The villagers who had once deferred to Margaret's opinions now whispered behind their hands as she passed. They had seen her weakness, her fallibility. Questions began to surface about her past, about her relationship with Clara, about the strange coincidence of Emily's disappearance years before. Sometimes, Robert told Clara that night as they sipped hot chocolate, "Nature does what people cannot. It reveals the truth." The frost-laden windows of Eldenford's library had become a canvas for winter's artistry, but inside, Mrs. Thompson moved between shelves with a heavy heart. The village council had delivered their verdict. Budget cuts would force the library's closure by spring. The elderly librarian's hands trembled as she sorted through century-old volumes that had survived wars and floods, but might not survive modern economics. Clara Smith learned of the news during her weekly reading session and immediately felt a fierce protectiveness toward the place that had become her sanctuary. "We can't let them take our stories," she whispered to Oliver Brown, who nodded solemnly beside her. That evening, Clara approached her uncle with determination in her eyes. Robert Johnson listened intently, his inventor's mind already calculating possibilities. Perhaps, he suggested, art could remind people why stories matter. Within days, Clara had mobilized a small army of children. The young girl who once hid in shadows now led with quiet confidence, teaching others to create illustrations inspired by their favorite books. The library walls soon bloomed with colorful interpretations of beloved tales, drawing curious parents who hadn't visited in years. Mrs. Thompson watched in amazement as attendance doubled, then tripled. "I never imagined," she murmured, her silver hair catching the light as she welcomed newcomers with tearful smiles. Meanwhile, Robert's practical contributions transformed the village in subtle ways. The schoolhouse, once frigid during winter mornings, now stayed comfortably warm thanks to his efficient heating system. The street lamps, previously unreliable, glowed steadily with his improved designs. Even the village water, once tinged with minerals, ran clear through his filtration method. "Johnson's got his uses after all," admitted Mr. Parker, the baker, who had once been among Robert's harshest critics. The sentiment spread through Eldenford like ripples in the river, changing perspectives one conversation at a time. Clara observed these shifts with quiet satisfaction during her walks with Oliver. "Things are different now," the boy remarked, kicking at patches of snow. "My dad says your uncle might not be as odd as everyone thought." The library became the heart of this transformation. When the council revisited their decision, they found themselves facing not just Clara and Mrs. Thompson, but dozens of villagers who had rediscovered the value of their shared heritage. "I move to maintain full funding," announced Councilwoman Wells, to thunderous applause. That evening, as snowflakes danced outside the windows, Clara sat beside her godmother among the books they had saved together. "You've found your voice," Mrs. Thompson whispered, squeezing the child's hand. The tide in Eldenford was indeed turning, washing away old prejudices and bringing new possibilities to shore. Clara's art transformed into something far more powerful than simple drawings. Each evening, she sat by her bedroom window at the Johnson estate, sketching with a determination that belied her 7 years. Page after page filled with haunting scenes. The old stone bridge with its crumbling edges, the swirling waters below, and most poignantly, her mother's gentle smile, details pulled from memories she fought to preserve. "These aren't just pictures," she explained to Oliver one afternoon, as they sat cross-legged on the mansion's polished floor. "They're my truth." The young boy nodded solemnly, understanding more than most adults in Eldenford. He traced a finger along one particularly detailed sketch of the riverbank. "You remember everything, don't you?" Clara's small hand trembled slightly as she added shadows to her latest work. "I have to. Otherwise, who will believe me?" Robert watched his niece's artistic evolution with a mixture of pride and heartache. Her sketches weren't merely therapeutic. They were evidence, each pencil stroke a testimony against Margaret's manipulations. He carefully preserved every drawing, dating and storing them in his workshop alongside his inventions. "You're building something important," Mrs. Thompson told Clara during one of their library sessions. The elderly librarian adjusted her spectacles, examining Clara's portfolio with reverence. "Some stories need to be told in pictures when words fail us." Yet their progress came with painful costs. Clara's newfound confidence was frequently undermined by moments of paralyzing fear. Certain sounds, rushing water, a sharp voice, footsteps on stone, could send her spiraling back to that foggy evening on the bridge. During these episodes, she would clutch her sketchbook like a shield. Robert, too, paid a price for standing against Margaret. Former business associates distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the controversy. 3 longtime friends from his university days canceled their annual visit, citing scheduling conflicts that fooled no one. They believe her lies, he confided to Mrs. Thompson one evening, his voice heavy with disappointment. After 20 years of friendship, the librarian's response was gentle but firm. True friends eventually find their way back to truth. Despite these setbacks, their makeshift family grew stronger. Oliver became a regular presence at the estate, bringing laughter and boyish energy to the grand old rooms. Mrs. Thompson supplied books and wisdom in equal measure, her silver hair catching the light as she shared stories by the fireplace. Even in February's shortest, darkest days, hope flickered persistently. Clara captured this hope in her most ambitious drawing yet, a detailed panorama of Eldenford viewed from the bridge, with tiny figures gathered along the riverbank. Faces turned toward the light. "What's happening there?" Robert asked, studying the scene. Clara's smile held the quiet confidence of someone who glimpsed a better future. The truth coming out. Just wait and see. The ice on the river cracked and groaned as early spring sunshine bathed Eldenford. Clara Smith stood at her bedroom window in the Johnson estate, watching chunks of ice drift downstream, carrying winter's remnants away. The thaw seemed symbolic, as if the river itself was finally ready to reveal its secrets. "The flooding left something behind," Oliver told Clara one afternoon, his eyes bright with excitement. The boy had been exploring the ruins of Margaret's cottage, still damaged from the winter floods. "There's a door in the ground I never noticed before." Clara hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. The thought of returning to any place connected to her stepmother made her stomach tighten. Yet curiosity won out. Together with Oliver, she ventured to the cottage, their footsteps cautious on the muddy path. The cellar door was partially exposed where floodwaters had washed away years of carefully placed soil. Oliver pried it open with a stick, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. Mrs. Thompson, who had accompanied them as a watchful guardian, shone her torch into the opening. "We should tell your uncle," the librarian suggested, but Clara was already descending, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. The cellar smelled of damp earth and forgotten things. In the beam of Mrs. Thompson's light, Clara spotted a wooden chest tucked beneath a shelf. Her heart pounded as she lifted its heavy lid. Inside lay dozens of letters bound with faded ribbon, all in her mother's handwriting. "She wrote to me," Clara whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she clutched the precious papers. "All this time I thought she didn't care." The letters reveal the devastating truth. Her mother had never abandoned her. Margaret had intercepted every message, hiding them away while telling Clara her mother wanted nothing to do with her. Meanwhile, across the village, Robert Johnson sat in his study, surrounded by legal documents recovered from his sister's old solicitor. His hands trembled as he unfolded a yellowed marriage certificate and a legal guardianship declaration. The papers named him as Clara's rightful guardian in the event of her mother's death, documents Margaret had suppressed for years. When Robert showed the papers to the village council, the revelation sent shockwaves through Eldenford. Respected families who had sided with Margaret now avoided eye contact in the village square. The schoolteacher who had labeled Clara troubled suddenly found reasons to praise her artwork. That evening, Clara and her uncle sat by the fireplace, her mother's letters spread between them like a bridge connecting past to present. "She never stopped loving you," Robert said softly, his voice catching. "And neither did I." Clara nodded, clutching a letter to her chest. The truth had been buried, but like the river in spring, it had found its way to the surface at last. The spring festival dawned bright and clear, bathing Eldenford in golden light. Children hurried along the cobblestone paths toward the Johnson estate, their arms laden with artwork and homemade inventions. The annual celebration had transformed under Robert's influence, becoming a showcase of creativity rather than mere tradition. Clara Smith stood before her display, hands trembling slightly as she arranged her river sketches. Each drawing had been carefully created over months of healing and remembrance. Mrs. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, her silver hair catching the morning light. "Your mother would be proud," the librarian whispered. The village square buzzed with excitement as families gathered around the displays. Oliver Brown helped Clara adjust her final piece, a panoramic view of the old stone bridge, rendered with surprising detail for a 7-year-old's hand. "They need to see everything," he said, his eyes reflecting the determination he developed since losing his sister. When Robert Johnson rang the ceremonial bell, the crowd fell silent. The eccentric millionaire, once scorned by the village, now commanded respect in his tailored suit and kind smile. He gestured toward Clara's display, inviting everyone to approach. "My niece has a story to tell," he announced, his voice steady but emotional. Clara stepped forward, small but resolute. "These aren't just drawings," she explained, her voice gaining strength with each word. "They're memories, they're evidence." The villagers moved closer, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock as they began to understand. Each sketch revealed another piece of the puzzle, the hidden cellar beneath Margaret's cottage, the secret marriage contract naming Robert as guardian, the coded messages in her mother's letters. Most powerful was a recreation of the faded painting showing Clara's mother hand in hand with Robert, proof of the family bond Margaret had tried to sever. Beside it hung a drawing of the night on the bridge, rendered with a child's honesty but an artist's eye for truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Thompson quietly explained the connections to those who still didn't understand, her librarian's voice carrying the weight of village history. "All this time," whispered one woman who had once believed Margaret's lies, "the poor child was telling the truth." Oliver stood protectively beside his friend as the villagers absorbed the reality before them. For the first time, they saw Clara not as a troubled child with an overactive imagination, but as a survivor and a witness, a little girl who had found her voice through art when words had failed her. Robert watched from a distance, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The truth was finally emerging from the shadows, just as Clara herself had done, one careful, courageous stroke at a time. Margaret Smith stood in the village square, her elegant posture betraying the slightest tremor as the evidence mounted against her. The spring festival had transformed into an impromptu tribunal, with Clara's artwork serving as silent testimony to years of manipulation and cruelty. "These are merely the fantasies of a troubled child," Margaret declared, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. But her words rang hollow as Robert Johnson stepped forward, the secret marriage contract held firmly in his weathered hands. "My sister entrusted her daughter to me," he announced, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "This document proves what Margaret has hidden for years." The villagers murmured as they passed the yellowed paper among themselves. Mrs. Thompson stood beside Clara, her arm protectively around the child's shoulders. The elderly librarian's eyes never left Margaret's face, watching as the woman's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. "I only wanted what was best," Margaret insisted, but her voice faltered as Oliver Brown boldly stepped forward. "Like you wanted what was best for my sister?" the boy challenged, his young voice carrying surprising weight. "Before she disappeared?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The connection between Emily's disappearance and Margaret's guardianship had never been publicly acknowledged until now. Clara remained silent, her small hand clutching her sketchbook. The pain in her eyes spoke volumes, a testimony more powerful than any words could convey. One by one, the villagers who had once whispered about the troubled Smith girl turned their backs on the woman they had trusted. The shopkeeper who had always greeted Margaret with deference now refused to meet her gaze. The schoolteacher, who had accepted her excuses about Clara's absences, looked away in shame. Even the vicar, who had praised her charitable donations, stood firmly beside Robert. Margaret's composure finally shattered. Her elegant clothes suddenly seemed like a costume, her refined accent hollow. She backed away from the crowd, her eyes darting wildly from face to face, finding no allies among those she had manipulated for so long. That evening, as twilight settled over Eldenford, Margaret was seen loading a single suitcase into her automobile. No one came to bid her farewell. By morning, her cottage stood empty, the door left unlocked, a final admission of defeat. Her departure left a strange silence in the village, like the hush after a storm. For Clara and Robert, it marked the end of a dark chapter. For Eldenford, it was a reckoning, a community forced to confront how easily they had been swayed by appearances and how willingly they had overlooked the suffering of a child in their midst. With Margaret Smith gone from Eldenford, healing finally began to take root in Clara's young life. 3 months after her stepmother's departure, the 7-year-old stood ankle-deep in the river that had once been a source of terror. The cool water lapped against her skin as she closed her eyes, her small voice barely audible above the gentle current. "I'm still here," she whispered, as if announcing her survival to the water itself. Each morning, Clara ventured a little deeper into the river, conquering her fear inch by inch. By summer's end, she could wade to her knees without trembling, her sketchbook filled with drawings that transformed the once threatening water into something beautiful and alive. At the Johnson estate, Robert found his own path to peace. The millionaire inventor spent hours in his workshop, tinkering with gadgets that would never see completion. One evening, Mrs. Thompson discovered him sitting alone, holding a silver locket he'd crafted decades ago. "I was going to give this to her," he confided to the elderly librarian, opening the pendant to reveal a miniature portrait of Clara's mother. "Before I left Eldenford, before everything fell apart." The old woman placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Some gifts find their way home, even when delayed." The following day, Robert fastened the locket around Clara's neck. The child's fingers traced its delicate engravings, her eyes wide with wonder. "It was meant for your mother," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "Now it belongs to you." A new ritual formed between uncle and niece. Each morning, they shared tea by the riverbank, watching the sunrise paint the water gold. Robert brought a thermos of Earl Grey, Clara her sketchbook. Sometimes they spoke of her mother, piecing together memories like a jigsaw puzzle. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the chirping birds and scratching pencil. Oliver Brown often joined them, bringing wildflowers for Clara and mechanical puzzles for Robert to solve. The boy who had once lost his sister to the same waters now helped Clara build stone towers along the riverbank, marking safe places to wade. "The river remembers," he told her one afternoon, "but it doesn't hold grudges." In the village, whispers about the troubled Smith girl faded into admiration for young Clara Johnson, whose artwork now hung proudly in the library Mrs. Thompson had fought to preserve. The child who had once been silenced now spoke through vibrant colors and bold lines, her voice growing stronger with each passing day. At night, Robert would find Clara asleep with the locket clutched in her hand, her face peaceful at last. The years lost to lies and exile could never be reclaimed, but each sunrise brought the promise of new memories waiting to be made. Oliver Brown's friendship with Clara Smith blossomed into something lasting and profound. As summer arrived in Eldenford, the two children embarked on a symbolic project that would heal not just themselves, but the entire village. Together they rebuilt the old stone bridge, carefully placing each rock with determination and care, their laughter echoing across the water that had once inspired such terror. "This stone is for Emily," Oliver would say sometimes, his voice soft as he remembered his sister. Clara would squeeze his hand. understanding the weight of memory better than most adults ever could. The villagers noticed the children's dedication and gradually joined their efforts. Farmers brought sturdy stones from their fields, shopkeepers provided refreshments, and even the schoolteacher organized weekend work parties. What began as two children's project became a community endeavor, bringing together people who had once been divided by Margaret's manipulations. During this time, Mrs. Thompson revealed a truth she had kept hidden for years. She was Clara's godmother, appointed by Clara's mother before her death. The elderly librarian had watched from afar, unable to intervene directly while Margaret held power, but always keeping a protective eye on the child. "Your mother trusted me to guide you if anything happened to her." Mrs. Eldenford itself transformed, shedding its rigid adherence to appearances. Robert's inventions were no longer viewed with suspicion, but celebrated for their ingenuity. The village square hosted regular exhibitions, where children displayed their art and inventions without fear of judgment. The river, once a symbol of fear and tragedy, gradually became a place of healing and remembrance. Families picnicked along its banks. Children learned to swim in its gentler pools. And on quiet evenings, Clara would sit with her uncle, watching the sunset reflect on the water. "The river remembers everything," Clara told Robert one evening, "but now it carries good memories too." The village learned to value honesty over obedience, and tradition gave way to hope. As the bridge neared completion, it stood as a testament to resilience, not just of wood and stone, but of the human spirit that had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. 1 year had passed since that misty evening when Clara Smith's scream had pierced the twilight. The old stone bridge, once crumbling and ominous, now stood restored, each stone carefully replaced by villagers who had finally chosen truth over whispers. On this anniversary, Eldenford gathered there, not to remember trauma, but to celebrate healing. Clara stood at the center of the bridge, her small frame stronger now, flanked by Robert Johnson and Oliver Brown. Mrs. Thompson watched from nearby, her silver hair catching the golden sunset light, a proud smile warming her weathered face. The little girl's hands no longer trembled as she held up her latest drawing for all to see. "This is who I am now," she announced, her voice clear and steady where once it had quivered with fear. The artwork depicted Clara herself, standing tall beside the river that had once terrified her. In the picture, sunlight danced on water that no longer seemed threatening, and her smile, rendered with remarkable skill for an 8-year-old, radiated the confidence she had fought so hard to reclaim. Robert placed a gentle hand on his niece's shoulder, his eyes misty with emotion. The eccentric millionaire had transformed as much as the village itself, finding purpose in family after years of lonely invention. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered. Clara nodded, then carefully folded the drawing into a paper boat, a technique Oliver had taught her during their afternoons by the riverbank. The boy watched with quiet satisfaction, his own healing journey reflected in his friend's courage. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath and released the paper vessel into the current below. The crowd fell silent as it bobbed and weaved, carrying away the final remnants of fear. Mrs. Thompson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, remembering the frightened child who had once sought refuge among library books. "The river remembers everything," the librarian murmured to those standing nearby. "But so do we." As twilight deepened, lanterns illuminated the bridge, Robert's invention, powered by the river's own current. The village that had once been divided now stood united, forever changed by a child's courage and an uncle's determination to protect her. Clara looked out over Eldenford, at the Johnson estate where she now lived safely, at the library where she discovered her voice, at the friends who had believed her when others wouldn't. Margaret was long gone, having fled to avoid facing the consequences of her actions, but her shadow no longer darkened Clara's path. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said simply. taking Oliver's hand on one side and Robert's on the other. The river flowed beneath them, carrying stories onward, of fear transformed into courage, of isolation into community, of silence into truth. And Eldenford remembered.